Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Meyers, and I am pleased to be talking today with Richard Waugaman, who is a psychoanalyst and an Oxfordian, starting with his discovery of a paper in the New York Times, actually, in I think 2002. Rick has a bachelor's degree from Princeton and medical training at Duke, as well as psychoanalytic training in Washington. And this year, he is the Oxfordian of the Year in recognition of his nearly 100 papers on the authorship issue, as well as multiple presentations that you can find on YouTube and many articles that have been printed in Oxfordian publications that you can access through the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. So Rick, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I'm curious as to how your interest in the connection between Henry VIII and Falstaff began.
I can't remember, but I did notice that in the endnotes to my article in the Oxfordian on this topic, I have an endnote that jogged my memory that however I came up with this interest, in April 2011, I posted something on a mainstream Shakespeare listserv. I said, I am curious how others feel about the possibility that Shakespeare's Falstaff spoofed not just Sir John Oldcastle, but was more subtly and subversively aimed at memories of the aging Henry VIII. So that's when it started. What is that? 11 years ago. And then I watched a film, maybe I can put it up here, and if this doesn't work well, I try not to get too caught up in that. And a film, Chimes at Midnight. It's an old film that was written, directed, and acted in by Orson Welles. And because of copyright issues, it was not publicly available for many, many years. And I'd never seen it, but I'd always heard it is one of the very best Shakespeare films. So it got re-released about 3 years ago. And my wife, Elizabeth, and I saw it and loved it so much, we showed it to friends at our monthly movie nights 2 or 3 more times. And as I was watching that film, I thought, maybe Fat Falstaff was supposed to remind Queen Elizabeth of her fat father, King Henry VIII. So that's how my interest in that got revived. So I then posted on that same listserv run by a mainstream scholar, Hardy Cook, let's see, so this was 7 years after I first posted. I asked, has anyone raised the question as to whether all the fat jokes about Falstaff might be subtle allusions to Henry VIII? And I'd forgotten this until I was rereading my notes, but 4 days later, Sir Brian Vickers, a respected mainstream Shakespeare scholar, emailed me personally and said, thanks for that interesting piece on Henry VIII and Falstaff. I hope you'll send it to Notes and Queries. Notes and Queries being a mainstream English literature journal. So I did. I wrote to him a few months later that I sent the whole thing to Notes and Queries, and they said they would publish the part of my article about Henry VIII's brain injury, but I would have to do a lot of revisions to convince them about the connection between Henry VIII and Falstaff. So anyway, he replied to that saying he hoped I would find a home for the rest of the article, which I did in the Oxfordian. So anyway, I know that's a lot of detail, but it's one of those times I've been pleased to get encouragement from a mainstream Stratfordian Shakespeare scholar. It does happen.
And hopefully it'll happen more and more. Why don't we go now into those connections as you see them and as you wrote about them in your article published in the Oxfordian number 22.
Okay.
Talk about those connections and from both a medical and a psychological point of view.
I'm happy to do that. And because I'm still trying to learn screen share, I tried to share another image. And Bob, you'll tell me, I can't see on my screen what's on here, but just if the listeners, if you and the listeners would bear this image in mind. Now, this is a coat of arms,
right.
Actual coat of arms of King Henry VIII from late in his life that's at the Met in New York. And okay, so you've seen that one, and now I'll show you a new one. So is the new image up there?
Orson Welles is up there.
Okay. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, I don't know that I need to say anything else. I will, of course, but.
Wait a minute. We got a lot of time devoted here. I want to hear you talk.
Now, I gotta confess, Bob, I never do PowerPoints, and I'm struggling with the screen share. And the reason is, unlike my wife, Elizabeth, who is a talented painter, in addition to being a talented Shakespeare scholar, I am not visual at all. So, I mean, I don't want to give examples because it would be embarrassing.
Well, you're okay so far.
Okay. So now what I've noticed about my idea about this is that it not only was too controversial for Notes and Queries to publish my whole article. They did publish the first part, which I can go into about Henry VIII and how he got to be so fat, because he wasn't always so fat. But even among Oxfordians, I can't say that my idea has really gotten legs to any extent, or if people agree with me, they have been very discreet, keeping that to themselves. And people who disagree with me have been vocal. And at one of our movie nights, when we were showing the Orson Welles film Chimes at Midnight, we always have a discussion after the film, half an hour or so. And I mentioned, gee, could this be related to Henry VIII? And somebody told me, no, it's not. No, Falstaff represents Edward de Vere himself, which is fine. But here's what I wanted to say about that. And this is just a preamble to getting into the rest of my thoughts about this. That one thing that's drummed into our head in our psychoanalytic training is that one thing can represent several things. You don't have sort of one image in a dream that means only one thing. And this was something Freud kept coming back to, the general category of complexity in terms of psychology, especially when you include unconscious aspects of human psychology, including as they relate to creativity. So he would say, the dream we remember is called the manifest content. All the many, many unconscious meanings he called the latent content. So he said, in fact, if an image from the unconscious manages to work its way into the consciously remembered dream, the so-called manifest content, it is precisely because it represents simultaneously multiple thoughts in the unconscious. So, as I say, that gets drummed into our minds. And when I talk with colleagues who are not psychoanalysts, I have to keep reminding myself that the way I think is so influenced by my profession as a psychoanalyst. And
all right.
Yeah.
Let's go into your understanding of history and specifically Henry VIII. I would point out that Henry Wells and his armor are still on the screen. If you can figure out in the next step in your graphical, there you are. It could be a whole new career. Forget the psychology stuff. All right, so let's get into the history of Henry VIII. And let's see where that takes us. Okay,
so Henry VIII lived from 1491 to 1547. He had some health problems starting in his 30s. He had a hunting accident. Medical care wasn't what it is now back then. And the wound apparently never fully healed. And so he had a lot of recurrent problems from that. Anyway, when he was about 45 years old, he was already very, very heavy. He was going to get even heavier later. And he insisted on continuing to joust. he fancied himself an expert at everything. So he was jousting.
Well, he was king.
Yeah, he was king, and no one was
be better.
Oh no, yeah. One of the funniest examples of that is that every time he wrestled, he won every single time. So he has this meeting with King Francois I of France and challenges him to a wrestling match. Confident, it's no brainer, he's going to win. He gets defeated. It hadn't occurred to King Henry VIII that he always won because no one had the nerve to beat him at anything. So anyway, this is what happens when you're a king. Don't do it. So he's jousting, fully armored, gets knocked off his horse. He not only falls to the ground, his fully armored horse falls on top of him, knocking him unconscious.
So we're talking about a horse that weighs normally 1,500 pounds and has got another couple of hundred pounds of armor on it.
So you can imagine.
Falls on Henry and lands on his head.
Bam, bam, yeah. So puts him into a coma. And when somebody's in a coma, you don't know at the time if they're going to survive or not. And his coma apparently was at least 2 hours long.
Wow.
So Anne Boleyn, who's pregnant at the time, sees this happen and is freaked out. She's scared out of her mind that he's been killed. 5 days later, she miscarriages. This is important because the baby she miscarriages was a baby boy. And everybody knows how obsessed Henry VIII was about having a son who would succeed him in this really sketchy Tudor line. His father, King Henry VII, was the first. And again, they did not have a really completely convincing claim to the throne. So one reason Henry VIII desperately wanted a male child. Anyway, so he had divorced his previous wife for failing to deliver, literally, a male child. So when Anne Boleyn has the miscarriage, she's disappointed. He, though, is devastated. The actual cause of her miscarriage may well have been her terror that her husband was dead. However, he interpreted it as a sign from God. Probably at deeper levels, if he were honest with himself, he would have interpreted it as God's punishment of Henry VIII himself for doing things like annulling the marriage of his previous wife. However, like any good monarch, he found a scapegoat, which was Anne Boleyn. And he decided that this meant he wasn't supposed to be married to her and that she had used not only feminine wiles, but maybe even diabolical wiles to seduce him away from his previous wife. Maybe she was a witch.
It's moments like that one is inclined, unfortunately, with the safety of time to sort of make a joke. There's nothing particularly funny about what Anne Boleyn went through and the terror she quite legitimately felt at seeing her husband really crushed.
Yes.
She may well have had other reasons, other biological reasons that caused the miscarriage.
Yeah.
But you can't eliminate that one.
Right. Oh, I agree. So one reason for you, Bob, bringing us back to what this meant to her was that one of the most important people in this story, as far as I'm concerned, is her daughter, who's not yet 3, the future Queen Elizabeth. So it was only 4 months after that jousting accident that took place in January that Henry VIII had Anne Boleyn beheaded. That was the first. Anne
Boleyn being Elizabeth's mother.
Elizabeth's mother. So we don't know how far back Elizabeth's conscious memories went, but there's a lot of evidence that sort of unconscious memories go back very early in life. Interestingly enough, just 2 months after her mother was executed, because King Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn was annulled, Queen Elizabeth became the princess, or lady, rather than Princess Elizabeth. And she commented on that. How was it yesterday? I was Princess Elizabeth and now just Lady Elizabeth. So this is at the age of hardly 3 years old. She sees something going on.
Does Henry's weight continue to go up?
Does it ever?
Successive marriages?
Does it ever? Yeah. And that was the main point of the article I got published in Notes and Queries, King Henry VIII's traumatic brain injury. and its effect on his obesity and growing truculence. I was delighted to use that word truculence because I once submitted a poem to the New Yorker about the dual nature of the wild boar. I can recite it if you want. Do we have time? It's very short. Okay.
Yeah.
This is, and the boar is related to Oxford. So what can we say? We got to include this. The dual nature of the wild boar, truculent, but succulent. So there we go. So that poem got turned down.
I'm deeply moved.
Okay, good.
Let me ask you about, as we go forward with Henry's marriages, what do we know about obesity at that time? We know today many people are overweight sometimes, and we have technical definitions of overweight compared to obese, etc. But was it the same thing then?
No way. No way. No, and I'm glad you asked me that, Bob, because otherwise we tend to project into the past circumstances from the present, presentism, we might call it, and that is a distortion. The chances are, unless you were wealthy back then, you barely had enough food to keep, body and soul together. But even we look at portraits of the aristocracy. They weren't obese like Henry VIII. He seems to have weighed 210 pounds in his 20s and been about 6'2". And based on that coat of armor I showed that's at the Met, by his death, he was nearly 400 pounds. And so all of his physical problems, by the way, were greatly worsened by his inability to curb his appetite. So I think my contribution in the article that got published in Notes and Queries is this can be an unusual but well-recognized complication of a traumatic brain injury, perhaps damage to the frontal lobes, interferes with restraint of one's appetite, and maybe for other metabolic reasons, the person simply cannot stop eating. And of course, his physicians tried to get him to curb his massive overeating. I mean, the descriptions of how much he could put away at one meal are just disgusting to read. So I'm not going to go into that, but yeah. So his fatness was iconic and still is. Oh, can I share the screen just one more time?
Yeah, sure.
Good. Okay. Let me see if I can do this just one more time. Now, I don't know how large this will be for viewers, but I'll read it. So this is a comic strip I faithfully read every day. Zitz is the teenager. His friend Pierce, it's his nickname because of all his piercing, says, "So your historical figure paper on Gandhi, how is it going?" And Zitz says, "Yeah, it's obviously because he has this imaginary Gandhi on his back. Can't wait to finish it, so his weight is off my back." Pierce replies, "Count your blessings," because he's been assigned to write about Henry VIII, and there's this massive Henry VIII on his back. Well, that's enough. I'll stop sharing. So the point there is, this was earlier this week. As of this week, this is still iconic. When people think of King Henry VIII, they think of how fat he is. Same with Falstaff. So my point is that when Oxford decides to include Falstaff as a character, one of the reasons is he's thinking about Queen Elizabeth's feelings about her father, who he died when she was about 13. So the last years of his life would have been when she was conscious, able to remember.
So before we go into Oxford, tell me about what other impacts that kind of traumatic brain injury could have on someone beyond weight.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Personality?
Absolutely. We're taught in medical school about a so-called frontal lobe syndrome. When people have damage to the frontal lobe because of a head injury or because of dementia, there's a characteristic group of symptoms which includes impaired judgment, greater irritability, personality changes, not for the better, for the worse.
Yeah, they don't become sweeter. They become
mean. Never.
Okay.
Never been reported. So these changes in Henry VIII very possibly were sequelae of his traumatic brain injury. But anyway, the important point is Queen Elizabeth would have known him at his worst, not at his best. But from historical accounts, there's every reason to believe he was a much better person when he was younger. Just as, can I say it? Just as Falstaff seems to have been a much better person when he was younger in terms of the loyalty of his friends. Hard to believe they would have been so loyal if he'd always been as obnoxious as he is when we see him on stage.
And so if Elizabeth, I guess then Princess Elizabeth at the age of 13, loses her father, at that age, what is the impact on a girl of the death of a father?
Typically, it's mixed. And one of the points I emphasize in my paper, again, because it should be common knowledge for psychoanalysts, it's not. The iconic Oedipus complex is more complicated than we usually portray it as, so that the girl at 13 very much loves her father, would rather have an exclusive relationship with him, with her mother out of the way, but simultaneously is very fond of her mother and feels very guilty about even unconscious death wishes toward her mother. That was especially true of Queen Elizabeth as a girl at 13 at the time her father died, because Catherine Parr at that time was Henry VIII.
Catherine Parr was
King Henry VIII's wife at that point, I guess his last wife. And she was a wonderful stepmother to Elizabeth. We have lots and lots of evidence documenting that. So that would have been a great, an important relationship for Elizabeth in addition to the loss of her father.
So can we now transition from Henry VIII, the historical figure, to Falstaff, the dramatic figure, or the figure on stage, because there's a lot of comedy as well as bathos there. But
sure.
How do we make that transition?
I begin with the body. Just in preparation for our conversation, I looked something up on the World Shakespeare Bibliography. And what I looked for were all of the articles in that database that include the word embodiment. That's gotten to be a popular topic in Shakespeare scholarship. So over 800 articles that have the word embodiment. I then decided to look for how many of those articles had Falstaff in the title, over 500. So there you go. In terms of Shakespeare scholarship, over half of the people that thought to mention embodiment somewhere in the text of their article were talking about Falstaff in the title. So my point is that connection, Falstaff's body, Henry VIII's body, is where we should begin, but it doesn't stop there. So as I was responding to editorial feedback about the draft of my article on this topic, I was asked to provide exactly the information you're now asking me about, Bob. And I have to admit, I hadn't really looked into that before I was asked to. So I found it fascinating, just going through all kinds of things, how bright Henry VIII was known to be, how bright Falstaff was. One scholar just oohs and ahs about Falstaff's enormous intelligence. And that wasn't Harold Bloom. As people may know, Falstaff was Harold Bloom's favorite character in Shakespeare, just possible he identified with him in one way or the other. But you just go through all the things. Falstaff is quoting from the Bible in Latin. Half the biblical allusions in these plays are on the part of Falstaff. He talks about as poor as Job at one point, and a character in the later play, Merry Wives of Windsor, asks him, do you mean as poor as Job? So, here's an echo in a later play. That's the character in that play remembered what Falstaff had said in the earlier play.
And what about the rejection of Falstaff by King Henry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. I think that may get into some of the subtlety of what the author of this play assumed to be Queen Elizabeth's psychological conflicts about her father. Among other things, she wasn't just any 13-year-old losing her father. She was the daughter of the King of England.
Right.
And she was allowed to succeed him, although that was touch and go for a while. So she had to, at some level, be grateful that her father paved the way for her to sit on the throne. You sort of have to imagine that's something people would want. On the other hand, this is the same father that had her mother killed. So it's complex. So I think this may be something for us to keep in mind in terms of the complexity of Falstaff's character, that he's beloved initially by Prince Hal, and then he's rejected and exiled and threatened with death. So my idea is that good literature captures any reader when it echoes the complexity of our subjective worlds, which we may not fully appreciate consciously. An analyst, a late analyst I admire a lot, named Philip Bromberg, wrote about this, that we especially resonate with moments in literature or in a play where two or more of our, what he called self states, are activated. That is, parts of our identity that are intimately bound up with certain memories, experiences, feelings, and so on. And so that something as simple as sadness and humor at the same moment in a play may resonate with us because it's bringing together different aspects of ourselves we usually keep compartmentalized. So I think things like that are happening. Can I tell a quick story about that analyst, Philip Bromberg?
Sure.
I learned this only recently. So he didn't start off as a psychologist. Nobody does. They've got to grow up and everything first. But anyway, he's in college and he really loves literature. So he goes to graduate school in English. And first year, perhaps in graduate school, he writes an essay talking about the speculative backstory of one of the characters. And this is in the age of new criticism, where it's all about the text and you don't speculate and so on. And his teacher, in front of the whole class, rebuked Bromberg and said, "We don't do that sort of thing." So he took it to heart and dropped out of graduate school in English. Became a psychologist. Yeah, it really does. Things haven't changed all that much. So I think that helps explain his unusual perceptiveness about our psychological responses to literature. I find it very inspiring.
Was there any risk for Oxford, whom we are saying is the author or principal author of the plays, was there any risk in portraying Falstaff in such a way that Elizabeth would know that Falstaff equaled dad, and maybe she didn't want her father, dead father, ridiculed that way?
I think that is very, very likely, very, very likely. Let's just keep in mind that earlier in his life, he knew what the rules at court were, and they were pretty strict. And Queen Elizabeth fancied herself kind of a version of the Virgin Mary, emphasizing virgin. And the same with his ladies in waiting. They were supposed to be like the Vestal Virgins in Rome. You know, serious consequences if the Vestal Virgins got pregnant, unless it was Immaculate Conception, implied they'd had sex. So anyway, so knowing that, Oxford impregnates his mistress, Anne Vavasour. And when the baby's born, all three of them get thrown into the Tower. And Oxford is then banished from court for a period of 2 years. So he knew what the line was, but, you know, speaking of the frontal lobes, he could not restrain himself from getting right up to the line. He never crossed it to the extent of getting executed, but, you know, exile is pretty serious in terms of the public humiliation that entailed. So I think he was described as one of the Queen's favorite courtiers when he was in his early 20s. I think she continued to admire him, be fond of him, starting in 1586. When he's 36, she gives him this very unprecedented annuity of £1,000 a year, possibly to subsidize his writing plays that will put the Tudor line in the best light historically, lessening the risk of civil war and so on. So, yeah, I think he knew he could get away with more than most people could, but still there were limits.
One of the things that impressed me in your paper was, oops, I had it here a second ago, was the use of the word lever, L-E-V-E-R. I mean, now, the reference is, I had read previously that Henry VIII had to use levers, or those chairs, I guess, that you, so he could go upstairs.
Yeah.
And you determined that there's only one reference of levers in the works of Shakespeare, and it is in reference to Henry VIII. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. These things are very, very easy to research. There are all kinds of free online concordances of the complete works of Shakespeare. So if you come across an interesting word in a certain play or poem of Shakespeare, it's easy to look it up and see where else he's used that, or if he's never used it anywhere else. So yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting as a hint to the court audience. And by the way, the work of Richard Dutton and William Streitberger both published books in 2016 independently, reaching the same conclusion that Shakespeare's plays were written primarily for court performance, not primarily for public performance. So that I think is really crucial to our understanding of all of Shakespeare's plays, and certainly crucial to my thesis in this.
So if I'm a noble and I'm watching the play, I'm going to have a significantly different response,
absolutely,
than if I'm a draftsman on the sitting on the ground.
Yeah, that's a really important point, an important topic in our understanding of the plays. The texts we have, say in the first folio, there may be just one play in the entire first folio that was what was the script for court performance. And I'm thinking of Henry V, thinking of the fact that it has an entire scene written in French. And courtiers would have, of course, understood that entire scene. And
you mean somebody growing up in Stratford would not have known French enough to talk to the...
I'm sorry to break it to you. I'm sorry. I know this is painful, Bob. I know you've always looked up to everybody that lived in Stratford, and you've looked up to their wonderful grammar school and so on. Bad news. No, French was not commonly spoken. So
I'm really disappointed. So two things, at least for me to perhaps bring this really interesting interview to a close. One, I'm going to do an interview with Ramon Jimenez, actually in a couple of hours, but I don't know when it'll appear on screen, whose new book is The Famous Victories of Henry V, where he shows that play was a precursor to the actual Henry V. The other one is, I'm going to plug one of your role models, idols, Sigmund Freud, and say that when I was as a junior and senior in high school, I bought, and was a hard copy, and it was a lot of my allowance, The Interpretation of Dreams.
Fantastic.
And I would say that was one of the most influential books I've ever read, because it basically helped me understand what the hell was going on at night, most of it. We'll censor that out. But it was absolutely fascinating. And so I was delighted to hear you bring the idea of dreams up in our conversation. Let me ask you if there is simply, what are you working on now that we might get together again in a bit, months or years, and talk about? What's your new research project?
Complexity in Shakespeare. And the backstory there is I was invited to be part of a book that is edited by two mainstream Shakespeare scholars. And they gave a seminar on this topic and allowed me to watch the YouTube recording of it, and then along with the people in that seminar to contribute a chapter. Their interest is psychoanalysis in Shakespeare. And so that's what the topic of the whole book is. And I narrowed it down to complexity, which isn't narrowing it down much, because complexity is a really complicated topic. But I am just loving the process of writing that chapter. That'll be due in another month.
That's great. This has been great. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Same here. Thank you so much, Bob.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.